The desert wind, a gritty whisper against the night, was the only sound Captain Eva Rostova allowed herself to hear. Lying prone on a cold ridge of sand, she was a ghost in the landscape, her ghillie suit blending seamlessly with the barren earth. The world, through her sniper scope, was a narrow, green-hued tunnel, and at the end of it was the man who held the key to a potential pandemic. Warlord Asadov. He stood in his courtyard, a fortress carved into the mountains behind him, laughing with his lieutenants. He felt untouchable. Eva's finger rested on the trigger, a familiar, cold pressure. The crosshairs danced over his temple. One shot, one gentle squeeze. She could end his reign of terror before he even heard the sound. She could avenge the villages he had turned to ash. Her body was perfectly still, her breathing slowed to a near standstill. The calculations were automatic. Distance, 740 meters. Wind, 5 knots from the west. She could make the shot in her sleep. A soft, steady voice whispered in her earpiece, a lifeline to the only other person who knew she was there. Wind's shifting. Hold steady. Sergeant Jasmine Jazz Cater was her eyes and ears, her spotter, and her only backup. They were 2 women against a small army. The mission, Crimson Sands, was clear. Infiltrate the compound, locate and extract the captured virologist, Dr. Aris, and exfiltrate without a trace. Capture, do not terminate. Asadov's knowledge was as valuable as the doctor's. The orders were a cage around Ava's instincts. She watched Asadov gesture broadly, his silhouette a stark black against the firelight. He was a monster who traded in weapons and human lives, and she was forced to let him breathe. A flicker of movement to her left. A guard, bored and restless, was patrolling the outer perimeter. His path was bringing him closer to their position. Too close! Jazz, we have a wanderer, Eva murmured, her voice barely audible. 10 o'clock, 70 meters and closing. I see him. Jazz's reply was calm, a rock in the rising tension. He's not alert, just stretching his legs. Hold position! Eva didn't move. The guard stopped, fumbled in his pocket for a cigarette, and lit it. The sudden flare of the match illuminated his young, tired face. He was just a boy. He leaned against a rock, blowing smoke into the night air, completely unaware that 2 of the most highly trained operatives on the planet were lying less than 100 meters away. His flashlight, a cheap, powerful beam, swung idly from his hand. It swept across the sand, painting the ground with light, moving in a lazy arc. It was coming directly toward them. Eva's muscles coiled. If that light hit her scope lens, it would reflect like a beacon. They would be discovered. The mission would be over before it began. They would be dead. She had seconds to decide. Abort the mission and retreat, or stay and risk everything. The beam crept closer, illuminating pebbles and scrub brush. She could hear the guard humming a tuneless song. Jazz was silent, trusting Eva's judgment completely. The light touched the edge of her ghillie suit. Eva stopped breathing. The world narrowed to that single, blinding point of light. She could feel the weight of the suppressed pistol on her hip. One quick move, one silent shot. But the sound, even suppressed, might carry. It was a gamble. The light began to crawl up her back toward the stock of her rifle. This was it. They were compromised. Her fingers started to move from the rifle trigger, ready to draw her pistol and engage. Suddenly, a shout echoed from the compound walls. The guard with the flashlight jerked his head up. The beam swung away, slicing through the darkness toward the sound. He cursed, dropped his cigarette, and jogged back toward his post, answering the call. The darkness rushed back in, deeper and more profound than before. Eva let out a slow, controlled breath. Her heart was a hammer in her chest. The immediate threat was gone, but the danger was far from over. They were still on the razor's edge. Too close, Jazz whispered, a trace of relief in her voice. They're changing the guard. This is our window. Let's move. Eva gave one last look through her scope. Asadov was gone, vanished back into his fortress. The virologist was still in there, somewhere in the maze of rooms and tunnels. The real work was about to begin. She carefully dismantled her rifle, each movement precise and practiced. They were going in. 2 ghosts against a fortress. The memory hit Jazz with the force of a physical blow, triggered by the fading shout of the guard. It was the smell. That specific mix of dust, cordite, and fear. It was the same smell from a year ago, a world away in a different desert. Under a similarly unforgiving sun, she had been Sergeant Jasmine Cater, U.S. Army combat medic attached to a forward operating base that was supposed to be secure. The first mortar round had shattered the afternoon calm. Then the machine gun fire started, a relentless, terrifying roar. The world dissolved into chaos, smoke, and the screams of the wounded. Her field hospital, marked clearly with red crosses, was not a sanctuary. It was a target. She remembered dragging a soldier with a leg wound behind a shattered Humvee, her hands slick with his blood. Then the shouting started. Not in Pashto or Arabic, but in Russian. A Spetsnaz unit on a parallel mission had been caught in the same vicious ambush. They were falling back, fighting for their lives. And their retreat path was taking them right through her position. A Russian soldier, no older than she was, took a round to the shoulder and went down hard, just yards from her makeshift aid station. His comrades tried to reach him, but a heavy machine gun pinned them down. To move was to die. Jazz saw it all from behind her cover. The soldier on the ground, trying to stem the flow of blood with his good hand. The desperate eyes of his team leader. The official rules of engagement, the political tensions, they all meant nothing in that moment. There was only a wounded soldier. She made the decision in a heartbeat. Slinging her medkit, she low-crawled out from behind the Humvee. Bullets kicked up dirt around her, stinging her face. She heard her own name being screamed by her CO, telling her to get back. She ignored it. Reaching the Russian soldier, she hooked her hands under his arms and started pulling. He was heavy, his gear catching on the rubble. She grunted with the effort, her muscles burning. A sniper's round snapped past her ear, so close she felt the wind of it. Then another figure was there, a woman with a face of sharp angles and cold, focused eyes. Captain Eva Rostova. She didn't speak. She just started firing, her rifle barking sharp, controlled bursts toward the machine gun nest, providing the cover Jazz desperately needed. Together they hauled the wounded man back to the relative safety of the ruined building. Jazz went to work immediately, applying a field dressing to the wound, while Eva stood guard at the doorway, a silent, deadly sentinel. When the pressure was stabilized, Jazz finally looked up. Their eyes met. No smiles were exchanged. No words of thanks. There was only a raw, unspoken understanding that transcended language and nationality. They were soldiers. In that hellish landscape, that was the only identity that mattered. Eva gave a single sharp nod. Jazz returned it. Then Eva was gone, melting back into the firefight to rejoin her unit. Back in the present, crouched in the dark beside that same woman, Jazz felt the solidity of that memory. It was the foundation everything was built on. Their governments had files and dossiers, but they had that moment. They had the shared visceral knowledge that the other would not break, would not leave a comrade behind. Jazz's fingers subconsciously found the 2 dog tags under her shirt. One was hers. The other was her brother's. His name was Marcus, Staff Sergeant Marcus Cater, killed in action in this very province, 2 years before she ever deployed. He had written her letters about the stark beauty of the mountains, about the children who would beg for candy. He never wrote about the fear, or the warlord named Asadov, whose men had planted the IED that took his life. This mission, Crimson Sands, was personal in a way no other had been. It wasn't just about stopping a bioweapon or capturing a warlord. It was about walking the same ground her brother had. It was about finishing a fight he had started. She looked at Eva's profile, sharp and focused in the starlight. She trusted this woman with her life, not because of a command, but because of a debt paid in blood and courage in a dusty village under fire. They were an alliance forged not in a briefing room, but in fire, and tonight, they were going to need every ounce of that trust. The silence after the guard's departure was heavier than the darkness. It was a living thing, thick with the threat of discovery. Eva gave a single sharp hand signal. Move! They became less than phantoms, flowing down the rocky incline with a grace that defied their heavy gear and the treacherous footing. Every footfall was planned, every breath controlled. The compound wall loomed ahead, a sheer 20-foot-high barrier of sun-baked mud and stone, topped with a tangle of razor wire that glittered faintly in the starlight. Jazz took the lead, her suppressed pistol held tight against her chest. Her eyes, adjusted to the amplified green world of her night vision goggles, scanned the base of the wall. Their intelligence was good. A narrow sewage runoff channel, dry and caked with filth, offered a sliver of space. It was a tight, disgusting fit, but it was their way in. She paused at the edge, listening. From the other side of the wall, they could hear the muffled sounds of life, raucous laughter, the clatter of dishes, a radio playing static-filled music. The enemy was complacent, secure in their remote fortress. Eva covered their six, her body turned outward, her senses screaming. The ridge they had just left felt 1,000 miles away. They were in the belly of the beast now, exposed in the open ground between the desert and the wall. A single patrol looking in the right direction would spell the end. She watched Jazz slip into the channel, disappearing into the blackness. A moment later, her voice was a whisper in Eva's earpiece. "Clear. Short drop on the other side." Eva followed, the coarse grit of the channel scraping against her back. The smell was overwhelming, a pungent mix of decay and human waste. She ignored it, focusing on the patch of sky at the other end. She emerged inside the perimeter, dropping silently into a crouch beside Jazz in a narrow, shadow-filled alley between two low-slung storage buildings. They were inside the hornet's nest. The sounds were louder here, more distinct. They could hear individual voices, the sound of bootsteps on hard-packed earth. Jazz pointed toward a wooden watchtower 50 yards to their left. A single guard leaned against the railing, his rifle slung over his shoulder. He was looking out toward the desert, not inward. Their insertion had been perfect. Eva nodded, her eyes already mapping their next move. The intelligence packet had indicated the prison cells were in the oldest part of the compound, a section built into the mountain itself. It was on the far side, past the main courtyard where Asadov held court. They moved in a series of rapid, fluid leaps from one patch of shadow to the next. A drunk militiaman stumbled out of a doorway just ahead, fumbling with his trousers. Jazz and Eva froze, pressing themselves into a recess in the mud-brick wall. Their dark camouflage made them part of the structure. The man never looked their way, shuffling off into the night, humming to himself. They waited until his sounds faded, then continued. The architecture was a chaotic maze, a testament to decades of haphazard construction. It worked to their advantage, providing ample cover. They reached the edge of the main courtyard, flattening themselves against a wall and peering around the corner. A large fire pit blazed in the center, surrounded by dozens of Asadov's men. They were eating, drinking, cleaning weapons. The Warlord was not present, but his presence was felt in the casual brutality of the scene. Crossing the open courtyard was impossible. Eva tapped Jazz's shoulder and pointed upward. A network of rough-hewn wooden beams and drying lines for laundry crisscrossed the alleyways above head height. It was a riskier path, exposed from below, but it bypassed the crowded square. Jazz gave a grim nod of agreement. She holstered her pistol and jumped, catching a beam and pulling herself up with silent strength. Eva followed, her movements just as fluid. They now moved like cats along the high road, their bodies low, their progress measured in inches. Below them, the enemy laughed and talked, completely unaware of the predators moving just over their heads. Every creak of the wood, every shift of weight, sounded like a thunderclap in their ears. They were halfway across the courtyard, the entrance to the mountain prison block now visible as a dark, arched opening on the far side. Freedom, and their target, was so close they could almost taste it. The beam beneath Jazz's hands groaned, a low, protesting sound that seemed to scream in the quiet night. She froze, her body pressed flat against the rough wood, her heart hammering against her ribs. Below, a militiaman paused mid-sentence, his head tilting as he listened. Jazz held her breath, her fingers aching from their grip. After a lifetime of seconds, the man shrugged and resumed his conversation, taking a long swig from a bottle. The immediate danger had passed, but the fragility of their position was now terrifyingly clear. They were balancing on a thread over a pit of wolves. Eva, just behind her, remained a statue. Her eyes, however, were constantly moving, calculating angles, planning their next move and their retreat. The dark archway of the prison block was a mere 30 feet away, but it felt like a mile. The path along the beams ended just short of it. They would have to drop down into a narrow, dimly lit alley for the final approach. It was the most vulnerable part of the journey so far. As they inched forward, Jazz's mind, usually so focused on the tactical present, drifted. The laughter from the men below, the smell of roasting meat, it was all so normal. It was a grotesque parody of a family barbecue, of the backyard gathering she remembered from before. Before Marcus, her brother's face, forever young and smiling in the framed photo on her mother's mantelpiece, flashed in her mind. He had written to her about the strange duality of this place, the breathtaking sunsets and the sudden brutal violence. He had written about the children, and the hope that maybe his presence was making a difference. He never got to finish that work. Asadov's men had seen to that. The intel packet had been clear. The Warlord had personally ordered the IED attack that targeted Marcus's patrol. This wasn't just a mission for Jazz. It was a reckoning. Every silent step she took was a step toward the man who had stolen the light from her family's world. Eva, watching Jazz's back, saw the subtle tension in her partner's shoulders. She recognized it, not as fear, but as the weight of memory. It was a burden she carried herself. As they reached the end of the beam and prepared to drop into the shadows below, Eva's own thoughts turned inward. She saw not the faces of her comrades in Spetsnaz, but the faces of the villagers from the satellite images, the hollow-eyed women, the children with no future. Her government's interest in Asadov was geopolitical. He was a destabilizing force, a client of a rival power. But for Eva, he was a cancer. A man who built his kingdom on the bones of the innocent. Capturing him was the mission. Making him answer for those hollow eyes was her personal crusade. She looked at Jazz, this American who fought with a medic's compassion and a warrior's fury, and knew they were bound by more than just orders. They were bound by a shared, burning need for justice. They dropped together, landing softly in the deep shadows of the alley. The archway was just ahead, an open maw leading into the cold, damp rock of the mountain. 2 guards stood flanking the entrance, more alert than the ones by the fire. They were the professionals, Asadov's personal guard. There would be no sneaking past them. Jazz looked at Eva, her eyes asking the silent question. Eva's response was a slow, deliberate nod. They had practiced this. They melted back into a deeper pool of darkness, becoming one with the wall. They would have to wait. A patrol would pass. A shift change would occur. Something would create a distraction. They had the patience of predators. They had come too far, carried too much weight to fail now. They settled in to wait. The sounds of the Warlord's feast a cruel soundtrack to their vigil. The final door was in sight. All they needed was one single fleeting opportunity. The wait was an eternity compressed into minutes. Each second stretched, filled with the coarse laughter and the crackle of the fire from the courtyard. The 2 guards at the prison entrance never moved, their postures rigid with a disciplined alertness that set them apart from the rabble. Then the break came. A shouted argument erupted near the fire pit. 2 of Asadov's men, their voices slurred with drink, began shoving each other over some unseen insult. The commotion grew, drawing the attention of the entire courtyard. One of the prison guards, unable to resist the drama, took a few steps forward, peering around the corner to get a better view. It was the distraction they needed. Eva moved first, a shadow detaching from a greater shadow. She closed the distance to the distracted guard in 3 swift, silent strides. Her arm snaked around his neck, applying precise pressure. There was no struggle, just a sudden limpness as he lost consciousness. She lowered him quietly to the ground. At the same moment, Jazz was on the remaining guard. He started to turn, sensing movement, but he was too late. The soft thud of her suppressed pistol was lost in the rising din of the argument. He crumpled. They dragged the bodies into the darkness of the alley, their hearts pounding not from exertion, but from the sheer, audacious risk of it all. They were now truly inside the lion's den. The prison archway swallowed them whole, the temperature dropping instantly. The air was cold, damp, and carried the unmistakable stench of despair, unwashed bodies, mildew, and fear. The passage was narrow, hewn directly from the mountain rock, lit by flickering bare bulbs hanging from wires. Cell doors, heavy wood reinforced with iron, lined the corridor. It was exactly as the blueprints had shown. They moved quickly, soundlessly, their weapons up and scanning. The sounds of the courtyard faded. replaced by an eerie, oppressive silence. According to the intelligence, Dr. Aris was being held in the last cell on the left, a special isolation chamber. They passed empty cells, their doors ajar, revealing straw-covered floors and rusted chains. Then they heard it, a soft, rhythmic scraping. It was coming from just ahead. Jazz signaled for a halt, pressing herself against the cold stone wall. She risked a quick glance around the corner. The final stretch of corridor was clear, but the door to the last cell was open. The scraping sound was emanating from within. This was wrong. It felt like a trap. Every instinct screamed at them to abort, to retreat. But the virologist was their mission. Ava's eyes met Jazz's, a silent conversation passing between them in a fraction of a second. They had to know. They had to see. With a shared, grim resolve, they advanced, flanking the open doorway. Jazz went in low, Ava high. The cell was small, barren, and empty. In the center of the floor lay a small metal food bowl, being pushed in a slow, endless circle by a large, scabrous rat. The scraping was the sound of the metal on stone. There was no Dr. Aris. There was no one. A cold dread, colder than the mountain rock, washed over Eva. "It's a setup," she breathed. The words were still hanging in the damp air when the world exploded. The single, bare bulb in the corridor behind them shattered, plunging them into near-total darkness. At the same moment, a heavy, reinforced steel door slammed down at the end of the corridor they had just come from, sealing them in. The crash was deafening, final. From hidden speakers, a voice echoed through the prison block, smooth, confident, and laced with cruel amusement. It was a voice they had both studied for hours. "Asadov, welcome," the voice said in heavily accented English. "I have been expecting you, my American friend and my Russian friend. You have come such a long way to die in my home." The klaxon began its ear-splitting wail, and from the other end of the corridor, the one that led deeper into the mountain, they heard the pounding of boots, many boots. They were not the hunters anymore. They were the prey, cornered in a stone cage. The hornet's nest had been kicked, and the hornets were pouring out directly toward them. The darkness was absolute, broken only by the frantic dance of muzzle flashes from down the corridor. The klaxon's shriek was a physical pressure against their eardrums, disorienting and terrifying. "Contact rear!" Ava yelled, her voice cutting through the chaos as she spun to face the new threat. They were trapped in a perfect kill box, a stone corridor with enemies advancing from both ends. "Jazz, the cell! Use it for cover!" Ava shouted, already firing controlled bursts down the passageway toward the approaching boots. The sharp, deafening reports of her rifle filled the cramped space, the spent brass casings clattering against the stone floor. Jazz didn't need to be told twice. She backpedaled into the empty cell they had just cleared, using the thick stone doorframe as protection. She switched her rifle to semi-automatic, picking her shots with lethal precision. A militiaman rounding the corner fell, then another. But more kept coming, their wild, undisciplined fire ricocheting off the walls and ceiling, filling the air with stone chips and dust. "We can't hold both sides!" Jazz yelled over the gunfire, ejecting a spent magazine and slamming a fresh one home with a practiced automatic motion. The smell of cordite was thick and acrid, burning their nostrils. "Focus on the rear." "I'll hold this side," Ava commanded. She was a force of nature, a statue of focused violence. She fired, moved to a new position, fired again. Each shot was economical, purposeful. A man with a grenade launcher slumped against the wall, his weapon clattering to the ground. But the advance from the courtyard side was relentless. They were pouring fire into the corridor, pinning Eva down. A round grazed her shoulder, a hot sear of pain that she ignored completely. Jazz fought her own battle at the other end. The enemy here was more cautious, using the natural bends in the rock corridor for cover. They were trying to flank her, to get a clean angle into the cell. She could hear them shouting to each other in Pashto. "They're stacking up for a rush," she warned Eva. She pulled a fragmentation grenade from her webbing, pulled the pin, and cooked it off for a 2 count before hurling it around the corner. The explosion was thunderous in the confined space, a flash of light and a wave of concussive force that was followed by screams and sudden silence from that direction. It was a temporary reprieve. Eva used the distraction. While the enemy from the courtyard was momentarily stunned by the grenade blast, she rose from her cover and unleashed a devastating full-auto burst, cutting down 3 men who had gotten too close. The corridor was now a charnel house, filled with the moans of the wounded and the unmoving bodies of the dead. But they were still trapped. The steel door was unbreachable, and more men would be coming from the mountainside now that the grenade's shock had worn off. "We're running out of ammo and time," Jazz called out, her voice hoarse. She was down to her last 2 magazines. Ava was likely in a similar state. They were bleeding ammunition and options. The initial plan was ash. The exfil point was a world away. Asadov had them exactly where he wanted them. Eva's mind raced, discarding one suicidal plan after another. They couldn't go back. They couldn't go forward. Their only way was up or down, and there was nothing. Then her eyes, adjusted to the strobing darkness, caught a detail they had missed in their initial frantic entry into the cell. In the far corner, partly hidden by a pile of filthy straw, was a heavy iron grate set into the floor. A drainage channel. It was old, rusted, but it was a possibility. A desperate last-ditch possibility. Jazz! "The floor! There's a grate!" Ava shouted, firing another burst to keep the enemy heads down. "It's our only way out." Jazz risked a glance into the cell, her heart sinking. It looked ancient, probably led to a dead end or a sheer drop. But it was a chance. It was more than they had a moment ago. As she prepared to move to help Eva, a new sound joined the fray from the mountainside, the heavy mechanical sound of a bolt being thrown back on a large-caliber weapon. A machine gun was being set up. Once that was in place, their tiny cell would become a tomb. They had seconds, not minutes, left. The heavy clunk-clunk of the machine gun being set up at the far end of the corridor was a death sentence being pronounced. In seconds, a torrent of fire would shred the stone around their cell door, making any movement impossible. They were out of time! The grate! Now! Ava roared, unleashing a final punishing burst down the corridor to buy them a precious handful of seconds. Jazz didn't hesitate. She scrambled into the cell, holstering her rifle and grabbing the rusted iron grate with both hands. She pulled with all her strength, her muscles corded and straining. It didn't budge. Years of grime and corrosion had sealed it shut. "It's stuck!" she yelled, desperation edging into her voice. Eva fired again, the spent magazine ejecting from her rifle. She slapped in her last one. "Use a charge! A flashbang! Blow it!" Jazz immediately understood. She pulled a flashbang grenade from her kit, yanked the pin, and shoved it into the narrow gap between the grate and the stone floor. "Fire in the hole!" She dove back toward the doorframe as the small, concussive explosion erupted in the confined space. It wasn't enough to kill, but the force and shock were directed downward, blasting the grate loose in a shower of rust and stone fragments. A hail of machine gun fire finally tore into the corridor outside, exactly as predicted. The stone doorframe where Jazz had just been standing was pulverized. They were now completely pinned down inside the single cell, the only exit a smoking, jagged hole in the floor. "Go, I'll cover you!" Eva shouted, her rifle barking back at the muzzle flashes in the corridor. Jazz didn't argue. She dropped her legs into the hole, feeling for a purchase in the darkness, and lowered herself down. It was a tight, vertical shaft, dropping about 12 feet into a narrow, flowing stream of foul-smelling water. "I'm down! It's clear, come on!" she yelled up. Eva fired her last few rounds, the bolt locking back on an empty chamber. She discarded the rifle and drew her suppressed pistol. This was it. As she turned to make for the hole, the mountainside corridor erupted with a new, more focused volley of fire. Asadov's personal guards were making their final push, and leading them was the Warlord himself, a hulking silhouette in the flickering light, his AK-12 held ready. He saw Eva immediately, his eyes locking onto hers with a predator's glee. He raised his weapon. There was no cover, no time to aim her pistol. Ava braced for the impact. It never came. From the hole in the floor, a single, precise shot rang out. It struck Asadov square in the center of his chest. He staggered back, a look of profound shock on his face. His body armor had stopped the round, but the impact had saved Eva's life. Jazz had not descended. She had stayed, one hand gripping a rusted rung inside the shaft, her body contorted, her pistol aimed upward through the hole. She had seen the threat and taken the only shot she had. "Jazz, go!" Ava screamed, diving toward the opening. But Asadov, enraged and unharmed, recovered instantly. He ignored the pain in his ribs and leveled his rifle again. This time his aim was directly at Jazz, exposed in the shaft. The muzzle flashed. Jazz cried out as the round slammed into her side, just below her armor. The force was brutal, knocking the pistol from her hand and sending a searing, white-hot pain through her entire body. Her grip on the rung slipped. Eva reached the edge of the hole as Jazz fell back into the water below with a sickening splash. There was no time to see if she was alive or dead. Asadov and his men were seconds from overrunning the cell. Looking down into the blackness, then back at the advancing enemy, Eva faced an impossible choice. Save her partner or complete the mission and capture the high-value target who was now right in front of her. The choice was no choice at all. With a final, furious burst from her pistol toward Asadov, forcing him to take cover. Eva Rostova turned her back on the Warlord and the mission. She dropped down into the sewers, into the darkness after her friend. The mission was a failure, but she would not leave another soldier behind. The drop into the sewer channel was a plunge into freezing, suffocating blackness. The impact knocked the air from Eva's lungs, and the foul, oily water closed over her head. For a terrifying second, she was disoriented, tumbling in the current. Then her training kicked in. She fought her way to the surface, gasping, her pistol still miraculously clutched in her hand. The only light was a faint gray square from the hole above, already growing smaller as the current pulled her away. Shouts and flashlight beams stabbed down into the water from the cell, but they were already behind her. "Jazz!" she hissed, her voice a raw scrape in the darkness. There was no answer, only the gurgle of the water and the distant muffled sound of the alarm. Panic, cold and sharp, threatened to paralyze her. She had sacrificed the mission, Asadov, everything for a ghost. Then her flailing hand brushed against fabric. She grabbed it, hooking her fingers into the webbing of Jazz's tactical vest. She pulled, dragging a dead weight toward her. Jazz's head lolled back, her face pale and slick with water and sweat. But she was breathing, ragged, wet breaths that echoed in the tunnel. "Eva," she slurred, her voice thick with pain. "I'm here. I have you," Eva said, her voice firm, belying the terror gripping her heart. She could feel the warm, sticky flow of blood mixing with the cold water around Jazz's side. The bullet wound was bad. They needed to get out now. The current was their only guide. It had to lead somewhere outside the compound walls. They floated, half swimming, half drifting, through the endless claustrophobic darkness. Ava held Jazz with one arm, keeping her face above water, and used the other to fend off the slimy, crumbling walls of the tunnel. The sounds of pursuit faded, replaced by the dripping silence of the underground. Minutes stretched into an eternity of fear and cold. Then ahead, a change. A faint silvery light, the promise of moonlight. The tunnel opened into a larger, slower-moving channel, and at its end was a rusted grate, blocking the way out. Beyond it, she could see the open desert, freedom just 20 feet away. Hope, fierce and desperate, flared in her chest. She dragged Jazz to the side of the channel, where a narrow concrete ledge offered a moment of reprieve. The grate was thick, set deep into the stone. It would not be blown. They were out of explosives, out of time. Jazz was fading, her breathing becoming more shallow. "Leave me," Jazz whispered, her eyes fluttering closed. "Get to the exfil—" Ava ignored her. She would not. Not after all this. She slid back into the water, searching the grate, the walls, for any weakness, any flaw. Her fingers found it. One of the grate's massive hinges, on the right side, was rusted completely through. It wasn't locked by the crossbar, but by its own immense weight and the sediment packed around its base. She put her shoulder against the cold iron and pushed. Nothing. She strained until spots danced in her vision. The grate groaned but didn't move. "Jazz, I need you," Eva commanded, her voice cutting through the other woman's haze. "On 3, push." Somehow, a flicker of resolve returned to Jazz's eyes. She slid down from the ledge, biting back a scream of agony as the water hit her wound. She placed her good shoulder next to Eva's. For Marcus, she grunted. For both of us, Eva replied. Together, they pushed. A guttural, shared cry of effort tore from their throats, a fusion of pain, rage, and sheer, stubborn will. The grate shifted. Then, with a shriek of protesting metal, it tilted outward, crashing into the stream beyond. The way was open. The cold desert air had never tasted so sweet. They stumbled out of the pipe, collapsing onto the sandy bank, gasping and shivering under the vast, starlit sky. The compound was a dark silhouette behind them, its alarm now a faint, impotent whine. They had lost. They had not captured Asadov. They had not rescued the doctor, but they had each other. Eva immediately went to work, applying a field dressing to Jazz's wound, stemming the flow of blood. As she worked, the distant thump, thump, thump of helicopter rotors grew in the night. Their emergency exfil, answering their last-ditch beacon from the sewers. It was over. As the chopper flared for landing, its downdraft whipping sand around them, Jazz looked at Eva. There were no words for what had passed between them in that cell. No words for the choice to abandon a mission for a person. Reaching out, her hand trembling, Jazz placed it over Eva's where she held the bandage tight. Their eyes met. A Russian spy. An American soldier, soaked in sewage and blood, hunted and defeated. And yet, in that silent, shared look, there was a victory that no warlord could ever take from them. They had walked through hell, and they had walked out together.